Okay, so yeah, so I think right now I'm just going to talk about reasons why this is a problem. Like, you would think this is great. Look at all the fruit. There's a cluster here, a cluster here, here, here. It's wonderful, but too much of a good thing is not so good. I mean, if I were to let all these fruits ripen, it would be probably more than 30 fruit in a 6-inch space. And what that would do is leave too few leaves to provision that fruit with enough sugar to make it taste good or to size up. The fruits would be too close together. They would push each other off the stems when they ripen, but they'd also leave crevices and protected areas where a codling moth can lay their eggs and where they can act as nursery for apple worm maggots to infiltrate your fruit, and you'll always have more codling moth damage if you leave your fruit trees unthinned. So that's the first sort of most basic aspect. The secondary effects are also really important. If I don't thin my tree, if I leave the fruit this dense, then I run the risk of messing up the tree's physiology. It's actually keeping records. It doesn't care. It's actually pretty cheap to make fruit. It counts the seeds because the seeds are built from protein, from nitrogen, and they're physiologically expensive for the tree to produce. And so it keeps a count. And when its seed count exceeds a certain level, it says to itself, okay, no one's really taking care of me. I've got to conserve my resources. I am going to cut back on provisioning new flower bud formation for next season. So what you'll have is a year where you have thousands of tiny fruit in your tree. Those fall out to be disgusting, sour, and astringent things. And the next year you'll have nothing. And maybe the next year after that you might have nothing. But then the tree sort of recovers and will produce another bumper crop of junk fruit, and you'll have this kind of, they call it biennial bearing cycle, and that's what you want to avoid if you're an orchardist. Another reason you want to thin your fruit is that if you leave a small number of fruits on your tree, say instead of a couple thousand, I want to thin this tree to something like 60 or 70 fruit. Those can attain good size and they're sweet, but also if I leave just a few fruit on the tree, it can partition more energy toward vegetative growth, and so I won't stunt my tree as much. I can prevent or stop vegetative growth or advancement of my growing of my tree if I allow it to make too much fruit. It just overburdens it and I can't support it, and it puts all of its root root mass capacity into finishing that fruit and none of it into growing more tree. So we talked about thinning. So thinning these things, I want to carefully thin my fruit. Which one do I take off? How do you start? Okay, so I know, and how many do you want to leave? I like to leave my fruit like 6 inches apart. I like a 6-inch space, and I'll go 6 inches down the branch. So if these things are 4 inches as the codling moth flies, it's 8 inches as the beetle walks. So I'll leave one out here. This is a little bit in the sun. If it was in a really bad location, I might reconsider that and try to select fruit that were on the other side of the branch where the leaves can shade it and protect it from getting. And so I'm snapping this fruit off at the stem and leaving the spur intact and trying to not ravage the leaves that are going to support the rest of the fruit on the tree. And so I took this spur, I removed all the fruit. This one I removed all the fruit. This one I'll leave a single king fruit. I'm selecting for that center fruit. These ones on the underside are too close. But they're in a good position. There's a nice big one down here. I'm actually gonna take that one off. And so I've reduced this congestion of fruit from 30 down to 2. So I've got 2 fruit in here, and they're nicely spaced, and they'll get to be beautiful, big, ripe, nice fruit. And I just have to do my whole orchard. I've got about 800 trees, and I throw 400 flowers on the ground or 1,000 flowers on the ground and keep 40 to 100 fruit. So okay, so having just listened to what we were talking about with the apples, you might be tempted to thin your cherries, and generally people don't thin cherries in our area. They usually don't set heavy enough to be a problem, but they can be a problem. Like if it were to rain when these got bigger, there would be quite a bit of contact between these fruits, and where they touched, you might get something like that, which is maybe brown. It's some kind of, rot from contact or moisture. And I, in my orchard, I just sort of wait and see, and I don't proactively thin my cherries because it doesn't usually seem to be a huge problem. Rule of thumb, don't thin your cherries. They're probably not ever going to bear that many anyway. Okay, so now that brings us to pear trees, and pears are a little bit of a different issue. Like, they can make a lot of bloom. This thing is covered in bloom 2 weeks ago, and it's coming out of bloom, and it's got lots of clusters very close together. Some of the fruit spurs have more than one fruit on it, but generally people don't thin pears for a couple of reasons. One is the shape. They're long and they're thin at the neck, so they can kind of hang on the tree. Well, they hang down and they don't push one another off. But also they have a tendency to self-thin. And if you look at these clusters already so far, even just a week out of bloom, they're already loosening up, and a lot of these flowers, where flowers are falling off. I'm bouncing around
on
with
this one.
Yeah, so they're falling off by themselves. So, and I notice this process continues through the season for quite a while, for at least until into July or June. It'll continue to abscise, select for healthier fruit, and drop off ones that aren't as well connected. So I don't mess with it. I don't do this. I don't go around and knock those dead flowers off. I don't pull fruit off, except for possibly Seckel. Seckel is a small pear. We should cut and go to look for a Seckel tree. So that kind of brings us to plums, peaches, apricots. Do they need thinning? How should you thin? Like, this tree is not really ready to thin, so I can't demonstrate. It's just on the edge of declaring who's going to stay and who's not going to stay. But with our peaches, we've already thinned, and we're extremely brutal in our thinning process. We don't let a peach go closer than 4 inches apart, 3 inches apart, 4 inches apart. You figure a peach you want to thin, give them a good space in between. If you see two peaches touching, one's got to go. Take the worst peach off of there. And if you leave too many peaches on, they don't attain the sugar, they don't attain the quality, the tree suffers, the leaf curl will have more of an impact. It just lightens the load, and you get much better fruit. Now, we've never personally had to thin our apricot tree. It's never set heavy enough and consistently enough, throughout the tree to merit thinning, so we leave that untouched. But some of our plums are productive enough that they have congested fruit, and we have to separate the fruit by, maybe, what's the rule of thumb, twice the diameter of the finished fruit. What's the finished fruit? Is it a 2-inch fruit? Leave 4 inches apart, and that'll, if you do that, you'll still have a lot of fruit in your tree, and it'll size up, get full sugar and full flavor, and the tree will just be happier.